Hey, welcome back. Today we're actually going to get into the fallacies themselves. Working on informal fallacies, our first category are going to be the fallacies of ambiguity. And like I said, these can be somewhat humorous, as we'll see very shortly. But for now, why don't we go ahead and turn our attention to the actual content, the informal fallacies. And we're starting, like I said, with our first grouping, fallacies of ambiguity. Now, what do we mean? We already talked about this briefly in our introduction video, but now we're going to go obviously into a little bit more depth. So let's start with the fallacies of ambiguity, what we're talking about. Fallacies of ambiguity deal with errors due to unclear meaning of terms, right? We said that the arguments are vague or unclear or employ imprecise terms or grammar. If the meaning of a word or phrase or sentence shifts in the course of an argument and the conclusion depends on the shift in meaning, in order for you to arrive at your conclusion, then the argument's coming to what we call a fallacy of ambiguity, or committing a fallacy of ambiguity. So these are basically problems in language. A term is ambiguous if it can be understood in more than one way. And we've already seen a lot of these fallacies when we covered this section on rhetoric, because when it comes to persuasion, very often you're going to have fallacies being committed, and a lot of times they're going to be in the category of ambiguity. They also may be in some of the other categories that we're going to look at, but hopefully a lot of this stuff, or some of this stuff, is going to be familiar to you already because we've looked at it before in that context. So, fallacies of ambiguity. Let's just go through a list of fallacies to start with. Equivocation, that'll be the first one we deal with. Amphibology, accent, significance, distinction without a difference, and the prestige jargon fallacy. There's only 6. Like I said, this is a fairly small category. So let's jump in and start with equivocation. And what do we mean when we talk about equivocation? Okay, equivocation involves a key word or term that possesses more than one meaning. And in the course of the argument, the term could change meaning drastically from one sentence to another. And that change can actually occur in a few different ways. It will usually mislead the hearer, and that can occur accidentally or intentionally as kind of a sleight of hand, a way to deceive. So whether or not it's occurring accidentally or intentionally, it doesn't really matter so much as you being able to pick out what's going on and identify it before you fall victim to it. Now, in formal categorical logic, equivocation is related to what we call the four-term fallacy, which we saw in our last episode. So you're going to understand that a little bit more as we go forward. But for now, let's just compare this problem to the same thing we would encounter if we're dealing with what's called paronomasia, or a pun. The difference being that when you have it in an argument, it's usually something serious rather than a joke. Now, some people really like puns. Some people get irritated by puns. But puns play on words having more than one meaning or similar sounds. Okay, and lots of comedy plays on ambiguity in general. So we're going to see some things that, like I said, are fairly humorous. And we're going to start with actually a very classic comedy bit back from the 1940s. As a matter of fact, I think it actually started in the 1930s. But if you have never heard of Abbott and Costello, you're missing out on one of the greatest comic duos of all time. And this little clip that I'm about to play is from their most famous bit, and the whole thing hinges on the idea of equivocation. So here is the famous "Who's on First" scene.
Strange it may seem, they give ball players nowadays very peculiar names.
Funny names?
Nicknames, pet names.
Not as funny as my name, Sebastian Dinwiddie.
Oh, yes.
Funnier than that?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Now, on the St. Louis team, we have who's on first, what's on second, I don't know's on third.
That's what I want to find out. I want you to tell me the names of the fellas on the St. Louis team.
I'm telling you, who's on first, what's on second, I don't know's on third.
Do you know the fellas' names?
Yes.
Well, then who's playing first?
Yes.
I mean the fellow's name on first base.
Who?
The fellow playing first base for St. Louis.
Who?
The guy on first base.
Who is on first?
Well, what are you asking me for?
I'm not asking you, I'm telling you, who is on first?
I'm asking you who's on first.
That's probably enough of the video to get an idea of what's going on. But and again, this is what I hate to do. I don't want to really explain a joke because I think you should be able to get it on your own, because if I try to explain it, I'm generally going to ruin it. But I do want to point out what the whole bit revolves around is this idea of a word being used in more than one way. One of the characters is using the term as a question, the other is using it as a nickname, and they don't understand each other, so you've got that miscommunication. All right, that's the essence of equivocation. So let's take a look at some other puns, and bear with me. I'm just going to read through these. I'm not going to explain them. Like I said, trying to explain a pun is going to be like killing a joke. Now notice, sometimes jokes rely on sounds of the word, and not necessarily the spelling. Likewise, a fallacy may be more or less easy to spot depending on whether the argument is spoken or written. So you're going to notice that as we look through some of these, what you hear and what you read might not line up exactly. So we're not necessarily talking about one word that's literally changing its meaning, but you're going to get the general idea. So a bicycle can't stand on its own because it's too tired. A backward poet writes in verse. 5,000 hares have escaped from the zoo. The police are combing the area. A dentist pulled out the wrong tooth. It was accidental. A chiropractor's patients often crack under pressure. I think that's probably enough. So let's move on and talk about how the arguments are structured within equivocation. As in a normal argument, the premises should lead you to the conclusion, right? The conclusion should follow from the premises. But what happens is that the term or word or phrase that's being used in more than one sense is going to pull you away from that conclusion. It's going to prevent you from being able to draw that conclusion. Now, let's look at some examples. Some of these are taken from newspaper headlines. In newspaper headlines, it's very, very common to find equivocation going on, partly due to the way that they're written, but take a look at some of these, and I think you should be able to find the humor in these as well. Newspaper headline, juvenile court to try shooting defendant. Now, you can conclude that a juvenile court system has become exceedingly harsh if you read that and misunderstood what they were trying to communicate. Another one, and this isn't a newspaper headline, but an elephant is an animal, therefore a small elephant is a small animal. Right there you've got a little bit of an argument, and it's fairly simple, I think, to see what's going on, where the equivocation is going on. So in this one, the term small is the term that we're equivocating with. It can be understood differently with respect to the thing that it's describing, because small is what we would call a relative term, right? If you talk about a small elephant, very different picture in mind than a small bacterium. What we mean by small really does get its sense from the item it's attached to. We call those relative terms. Another example, and this one's going to be a little bit more complicated. Evolution is the natural or artificially induced process by which new and different organisms develop as a result of changes in genetic material. Such genetic changes are evident in the new characteristics produced by dog breeders over the last few centuries among various populations worldwide. Therefore, evolution is an undeniable fact. Now, the term evolution here changes between the initial premise and the conclusion. We might be talking about, small-scale evolution used as evidence of large-scale speciation, what we might call micro to macro evolution. Now, this isn't a critique of the theory of evolution. It's a criticism of this particular way of arguing. Now, remembering our lesson on critiquing arguments, refuting an argument does not disprove the conclusion. And all we're doing here is showing why this particular argument fails to reach its conclusion. Okay, so there's an equivocation issue. Let's take a look at one that might be even a little bit more complicated. This is a philosophical argument. So, if God is creatively active in the temporal world, God is really related to the temporal world. God is not really related to the temporal world, according to Thomas Aquinas. Therefore, we can conclude that God is not creatively active in the temporal world. Now, this is a theological argument, a philosophical twist to it. Now, speaking of the form of the argument, we would call this a valid modus tollens form of the hypothetical syllogism. So there's really no problem formally speaking, but equivocation is occurring at a specific place, and I think you could pick it out because I color-coded this one. The word really in red is where the equivocation is going on. In premise 1, really means truly. In premise 2, Aquinas had a very different meaning for the word really, and if you're not familiar with his philosophy, you wouldn't catch this, which is why you could make the mistake in going to that conclusion. But when he uses the word really, it means some kind of mutual dependence, the idea that the world acts upon God the same way that God acts upon the world. Maybe not necessarily the same way, but they interact with each other in a different sense than he would accept. So, therefore, the conclusion actually doesn't follow because we've changed our meaning halfway through the argument. Let's try to figure out where the problem is in this one. All good things should be legal. It's good to feel good. Beating up people you don't like makes you feel good. Therefore, beating up people you don't like should be legal. So which term is the problem here? It's obviously the term good. Now, what's going on with it? Well, we'd have to stop and ask yourself what we mean by the term good. In premise 1, it seems to mean morally good. In premise 2, we've shifted to the meaning pleasurable. So we're not talking about the same thing. So that's enough of equivocation. Let's talk about amphibology or amphibole. Might not have heard of that word, so let's explain it and specify exactly what we're looking at here. So an amphibology or amphibole involves the use of a grammatical construction that can be interpreted in more than one way, possibly two or even more ways. An argument commits the fallacy when an ambiguous statement serves as a premise with the interpretation that would make it true, but the conclusion is drawn from an interpretation that makes it false. So we start with a premise, and it's got an ambiguous statement in it, basically due to grammar, and it's going to pull you off into a conclusion that misrepresents or is based on a misinterpretation of that statement. So here's another film clip that's going to give you a little bit of an illustration of how this could be used. So it's not a word, pay attention, it's the phrase itself. That's the difference between equivocation and amphibole. So let's take a look at this very quick clip.
You think that's funny, huh? I'm gonna break your nose now. Oh. I want you to picture a bullet inside your head. Can you do that for me?
Fuck you. Anyway, that's ambiguous.
Ambiguous? No, I don't think so.
No, I think he means that when you say picture it inside your head, okay, is that a bullet will be inside your head or picture it in your head? Like
Harry,
form an
will you
image.
shut up?
He's got
Okay, you get the idea. That is all based, the ambiguity there is completely based on how that sentence is phrased. So let's look at some other examples of amphibology. Domino's is giving pizza away. Their sign says Domino's pizzas delivered free. Now, I think you would generally know what they mean, but you could misinterpret it. Reverend Smith said it was his privilege to marry 6 people yesterday, so Reverend Smith is a bigamist. Another newspaper headline, wife kills husband with shotgun. Does it mean that she used the shotgun to kill her husband, or did she kill him because he happened to have the shotgun? You can't tell. Another newspaper headline, 2 sisters reunited after 18 years at checkout counter. Talk about poor customer service. Here's an advertisement, and we already saw how much you can mess around with advertisements when we did our advertising tactics video, but let's see whether you can figure out where the problem is. Advertisement for a new exercise machine reads, you can only get one here. Now, what's the problem? You're probably thinking, well, it doesn't seem to be a problem. This is pretty clear. That is the only place you can get the exercise machine, but that's not literally what it means. It literally means you can get one here, but you can't do anything else here, right? You can't give it, you can't look at one, you can't try one. That would be implied by the language. But it's still possible that you can get it elsewhere. It's not actually precluding that. What it should read is you can get one only here. So this little one-word shift, the word only, modifying the wrong word, actually makes for a very different meaning. But again, if you're not aware, I think you'd understand what the person intended, and most likely a person putting an advertisement out like that did it accidentally. Okay, probably didn't do it intentionally. Now, this next one could very well have been done intentionally. So let's take a look at another advertisement, this one for a burger joint. And we may have actually looked at this in the video on advertising tactics. I don't remember off the top of my head, but our burgers are made with 100% pure beef. Sounds great. But there's a problem, and you might remember what it is. The ambiguous phrase, made with 100% pure beef. Here's what you think it says. This is the understood meaning. You think it means it's made entirely out of 100% pure beef. But what it actually says, the intended meaning, is that, well, 100% pure beef is at least one of the ingredients. So that's the only claim being made, and you can see how easy it might be to fall for that little tactic. Okay, that's all amphibology. Let's move on to the third one. This is going to be accent. Accent involves an improper emphasis on a word, phrase, or aspect of a statement. An argument commits a fallacy when a premise relies for its meaning on one particular emphasis, but the conclusion is drawn relying on a different emphasis. Now, this may be a matter of punctuation. If it's a written statement, could be a matter of inflection in the voice when it's a spoken statement. So let's take a look at one that I think you've come across many times if you use salad dressing or marinades or anything like that. This one, the label on the sauce I'm using for supper says, shake well before using. So I shook it right after breakfast. I'll let you think about that for a second. Another example. My mom said I'm not taking you to the movies, so I guess we're going to be home tonight. Is that the right conclusion? Well, it depends how she stressed the different parts of her sentence, right? You can read that statement, I'm not taking you to the movies, in a few different ways. So let's accent it a little bit different. She may have said, I'm not taking you to the movies, the implication being she might be taking the child elsewhere, or I'm not taking you to the movies, in which case maybe somebody else is taking the child, or I'm not taking you to the movies, in which case maybe the mom's going out without the child. So either way, the conclusion that we're going to be home is going to be false. So, like you said, emphasis, inflection makes a huge difference on the communication of the meaning. Now, let's look at the next one, which is significance. Significance involves language that has a different meaning depending on referent or context. Remember, context is always important when you're trying to understand what somebody is saying. And very often, people try to take people out of context on purpose to try to misrepresent them. So be very careful in understanding context. Here's some examples. Voicemail. Your father has just been rushed to the hospital. So what do? You rush right there. Now, this could be the wrong move, right? This could be the wrong conclusion that you need to go to the hospital, because I think you've all heard of wrong numbers, right? Somebody called, left a message, they didn't clarify very much, it's on your phone. If that was a message meant for somebody else, then it would be the wrong thing to assume that your father is the one in the hospital and that you need to go there, right? So the whole thing hinges on who the your refers to, right? That's what we mean by referent or context. Another example, Hesiod talked about creation of the world, so he was obviously a theist. Now, if you don't know who Hesiod is, he happens to be an ancient Greek poet. And when he uses the word creation, or when he talks about creation in his creation myth, known as the Theogony, right, he's doing it from a polytheistic worldview. He's not doing it from what we call a theistic worldview. And when we use the word theist, we generally mean somebody that believes in a single God. So context impacts definition and can lead to ambiguity. Next one is a distinction without a difference. So a distinction without a difference involves an attempt to defend an action or position by claiming that there is a difference from some other action or position when there actually is none. An argument may use different terms even though the definitions or concepts are actually the same, right? So different words, same concepts. Let's take a look at some examples of this one. The ancient Greeks did not consider exposure murder since the child was under 2 years old. Seems to be the same thing. You're going to be drawing your line at 2 years old. Why not draw it at 1 year old? Why not draw the line at 3 years old? Is there a difference between what's going on prior to year 2? You get the picture. Let's take a look at another little video clip. This one happens to come from one of my favorite sitcoms of all time, Seinfeld.
All right, Miss Bennett, all finished. Here's your new number.
646? What is this?
That's your new area code.
I thought 646 was just for new numbers.
This is a new number.
No. It's not a new number. It's just a changed number. See, it's not different. It's the same, just changed.
Look, I work for the phone company. I've had a lot of experience with semantics, so don't try to lure me into some maze of circular logic.
Okay, she's trying to make some kind of distinction between a changed number and a new number, as if the change of any number doesn't result in a completely different number. Okay, so it's a distinction she's trying to make without a difference. All right, some other examples real quickly. I don't hate him, I just don't like him, and I hope bad things happen to him. Sounds kind of like hate to me. I'm not saying that contradictory statements can each be true. I'm saying that I think all worldviews are equally correct. Or a more complicated one, I don't believe that there's a way things ought to be or that there's a way things are supposed to be. Those terms imply a moral order which I deny. There's no good or evil, only functional and dysfunctional. So the rapist, thief, murderer, they're not being immoral, they're only being dysfunctional. Now, what's the actual difference between dysfunctional and immoral? One has to know first how a human's supposed to function or ought to function before you can know that they're operating in a dysfunctional way. So dysfunctional means not functioning according to a correct pattern of behavior. If there's a right way to function, then there's a standard for moral behavior. And if there's a standard for human behavior, then there is a moral order. So changing the word doesn't make a real difference. Okay, finally we've arrived at the last one, which is prestige jargon fallacy. prestige jargon is any attempt to use complicated language to silence your opposition. Complex ways of speaking can be used to sway an audience. We've already seen that when we talk about rhetorical force, right? You have, if you use big words, it's going to sound really impressive. So one may use elaborate language or technical terms in order to sound smart or scientific, in order to trick an ignorant audience into believing that an intelligent argument's actually been presented. One may say things in such a complicated manner that people don't dare question the truthfulness of it. And I think the real gist of it is it's really hard to make a response when someone doesn't fully understand what's being said, right? Statements made in this manner serve generally as what we call smoke screens to cloud the argument. It's a diversion tactic. We're going to see this again later when we get to relevance fallacies. But the fallacy confuses complexity with authenticity, right? Now, I don't want to say it's always a fallacy when people use big words or complicated language, because sometimes it's necessary. It really depends on what we're talking about. It would be really, really difficult to explain, complex scientific stuff to the average layperson without using the proper vocabulary. So it's not always a fallacy, but still, it sometimes is used in just that way. So let's take a look at a few examples of prestige jargon. First one, capital is that dead labor that vampire-like only lives by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks. Karl Marx. Now, I don't know what he's talking about as far as capital goes. It's not really defining capital for me. Looks like he's trying to do a introduction to Bram Stoker's Dracula, but obviously it's rhetoric that he's doing here. It's not actual definition. Another example. Researchers utilize theorems of quantum mechanics to formulate axiomatic conclusions concerning metaphysical hypotheses of existence. Empirical verification concludes that virtual particles fluctuate spontaneously within a vacuum, ergo traditional cosmogonies are currently under suspicion. So there you have it. You've got 6 fallacies of ambiguity, and we are only scratching the surface. Hopefully those make sense to you. What the best thing to do is to go back and review them, look at examples, try to find examples on your own, practice being able to recognize where ambiguity is taking place, where terms are vague, where sentences are grammatically problematic that are going to lead to potential problems in dealing with an argument. So for now, we're going to set aside the fallacies of ambiguity, and in our next session, we're going to be moving on to the fallacies of relevance, which is a much, much larger category. So I'm probably going to break that down into a number of different videos. But until then, take care. See you later.